I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of something so messed up, something that made me question every choice I'd ever made, every line I'd ever drawn in the sand. But here I am, sitting in my truck, watching the sun bleed over the horizon, thinking about 12 graves, 12 families, and a golf course that wasn't supposed to exist there in the first place. It all started a few months back when I got a call from the county. One of those calls that make your stomach knot before your brain even processes the words. "We've got a problem," the voice said, calm but tight, like someone trying to convince themselves this was normal. "The Miller estate. They've expanded again. They're on the old cemetery property." My heart stopped, because I knew exactly which property he meant, the one on the outskirts of Hawthorne, a town so small people still wave at strangers and leave their doors unlocked, the kind of place where ghosts aren't just stories, they're family. And yet, someone decided that 12 graves didn't matter, that a few acres of sacred ground were worth nothing compared to a fairway. I remember driving there for the first time, dust kicking up under my tires, trees lining the road like silent witnesses, and seeing the construction for the first time. Heavy machinery, men in hard hats, the smell of diesel and disturbed earth, and there it was, freshly overturned soil, a wooden cross lying sideways, names barely legible, flowers crushed under the wheels. I couldn't breathe for a second. I just stood there, thinking this has to be illegal, thinking somebody's going to stop them, but the truth is, nobody had. Nobody cared. The Miller family, Victor and his two sons, tall, broad-shouldered, like they were carved out of the same arrogance that had built the country, were smiling over the chaos, snapping photos like tourists. I walked up to them, my hands shoved into my jacket pockets, trying to find the right words, but all I could manage was, "You can't do this. These people, these families." Victor waved me off, his grin sharp, teeth glinting. "Old graves don't pay taxes," he said. "And taxes pay for my golf balls. Move along." And just like that, everything I thought I knew about justice and community felt like a lie. I knew then that it wasn't just about the graves. It was about the people, the families who had lived in Hawthorne for generations, people who didn't just lose a plot of dirt, but a piece of their history, a piece of themselves. I thought about Mrs. Callahan, 90 years old, fragile as glass, clutching her husband's photograph every morning, tending to the rose bush she planted over his grave. I thought about the Thompson kids, who didn't understand why the grass their father had mowed every weekend was now a sand trap. I thought about all the stories, the picnics, the Sunday afternoon prayers, gone under a layer of concrete and synthetic grass. And me? I was supposed to enforce the law, supposed to do my job, which meant I was about to kick out every family who lived in those homes bordering the property, because somehow, expanding a golf course legally meant displacing people too. The first meeting was hell. You've never seen desperation until you've seen a room full of people whose homes are about to be taken, staring at you like you're both the messenger and the enemy. I tried to explain, tried to soften it, but the law doesn't care about roses or old photographs. "We'll be out by next Friday," I said, my voice trembling even though I tried not to show it. "You'll get relocation assistance, and we'll help with paperwork." And the room went silent, like someone had pulled the rug out from under them, except no one was laughing. Old man Jenkins slammed his hand on the table, dust puffing up. "Help? You call this help? They destroyed our graves, our memories, and now you want to help us fill out forms? Get the hell out of here." And that's when it hit me. The anger wasn't just anger. It was grief, it was disbelief, it was betrayal wrapped up in every trembling lip, every clenched fist, every pair of eyes staring right through me. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those crosses sideways, those letters half-buried, names like Margaret Callahan, Samuel Thompson, a dozen others whose voices I imagined pleading from the earth. I kept thinking about Victor Miller, sitting in his leather chair, watching his fairway grow, probably sipping bourbon, laughing at the world, thinking this was progress. And I hated him. God, I hated him. Not the casual kind of hate, but the kind that burns at your core, that makes you question if the rules you're living by are worth anything at all. And then I thought about my own family, my kids, and how I'd feel if someone decided that our history didn't matter, that our home wasn't sacred. That's when the first real confrontation happened. I went back to the property, not as a cop, not as an official, but as a man who had to look Victor Miller in the eye and let him know he couldn't just erase people. He was surveying the land, clipboard in hand, ignoring the chaos. I stepped up, trying to keep my voice steady. Victor, you've gone too far. You think a court will let this slide? You think people won't fight? He looked at me then, and I swear, for a second, I saw a flicker, not of guilt, but amusement. Fight? Against me? Buddy, I own this town. I own the land. And those graves, they were in the way. I laughed bitterly, trying not to cry. In the way? In the way of what? Your ego. He shrugged, and that's when it hit me. He didn't see them as people, as families, as history. They were obstacles. Grass, dirt, and inconvenience. And me? I was just the guy in the middle, trying to keep a thread of humanity alive while everything around me crumbled. By the time I left that day, I knew it was going to get worse before it got better. I knew the law wasn't on the side of roses and crosses, and I knew I was about to have to go door to door, knock on families' doors, and tell them they had to leave their homes, their memories, their lives. And every time I imagined it, I felt my chest tighten, because this wasn't just a job anymore. It was a moral battlefield, and the enemy wasn't just Victor Miller or his sons. It was the whole system that allowed 12 graves to disappear without a second thought. And that's how it started: 12 graves, 12 families, one golf course, and me, caught somewhere in the middle, trying to figure out how to enforce the law without losing my soul. The next few weeks were a blur, honestly. I spent more time in my truck than at home, driving up and down Hawthorne, knocking on doors, listening to people pour their hearts out like I could somehow patch the holes in their lives with my words. Some days I'd sit on a porch with a widow, her hands shaking as she held a cup of cold coffee, and she'd just stare at me, eyes wide, saying nothing for a long minute before whispering, "You're the one who's going to make us leave, aren't you?" And in that moment, I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to say, "No, I don't want to. I'm sorry." But instead, all that came out was, "I'm doing my job. I have to," and it felt hollow even as I said it. Because a job, any job, isn't supposed to rip families apart and crush history beneath a fairway. Then there were the confrontations with the Millers. Oh, they loved to make me squirm. Victor would show up at the edges of the property, golf glove on his hand, smirking, saying things like, "Why do you look so sad, officer? Did you get attached to the people who live in boxes now?" And his sons, taller than me by a head and twice as broad, would chuckle behind him. They didn't even try to hide the way they enjoyed watching me burn on the inside. But I started to notice cracks, tiny ones. Once, Victor slammed his clipboard down in frustration because a storm washed out part of the sand trap he'd just finished. I caught him muttering under his breath, something about too many things going wrong, and I realized for the first time. He was human, just a human with no empathy, and that realization didn't make it any easier to face him. Some nights, I'd drive past the cemetery, or what was left of it, the soil uneven, the flowers crushed, the crosses leaning like exhausted soldiers. And I'd remember a conversation I had with Mrs. Callahan, sitting on her porch with her cat in her lap. She'd told me stories about her husband, a man who built his house with his own hands, stories that made the history of this town feel like it was stitched into the very earth beneath me. "They can take the land," she said softly, "but they can't take the memories. Not unless we let them." And her words stuck, lodged in my chest, because I realized she was right. Legally, I might be the one knocking doors, but morally, the families were still alive, still fighting, in their own quiet ways. I started documenting everything. I didn't think it would help, not really, but it felt like a lifeline. Pictures of the graves before the bulldozers, recordings of the families talking about what they lost, video of Victor grinning like he'd won some kind of war over human decency. I even started reaching out to a few journalists, just whispers, careful, because I knew if the Millers caught wind, they'd do everything in their power to shut it down. And they were ruthless. Once, my car tires were slashed after a late-night visit to the property. A note left under my windshield wiper said, "Stop meddling, or next time it's worse." And I thought about calling the cops, but who? The same system that allowed them to destroy 12 graves? No, this was something I had to handle my own way, or I'd be complicit. The first real turning point came when I went door to door on Maple Street. Every family I visited, I felt the weight of my uniform, my authority, pressing down like it was some kind of weapon against their grief. But this one house, the Daniels family, they were different. Young kids, barely teenagers, running in and out, laughter cutting through the tension like a blade. Mr. Daniels opened the door, shaking his head before I could even speak. "We knew this day would come," he said, voice rough. "But we didn't think it'd be like this. 12 graves gone, and now our home." I swallowed hard, nodding. I know it's wrong. But," and he cut me off, stepping closer, eyes blazing. "You know nothing about wrong. You're the law, right? So you get to feel nothing while the rest of us lose everything." And there it was, the accusation I couldn't deny. I did feel it, every day, gnawing at me, but feeling didn't stop the legal hammer from falling. By now, the families were starting to push back, quietly at first, then more aggressively. Letters to the county, small protests at the edges of the property, kids holding signs while parents whispered prayers under their breath. And I felt torn because part of me wanted to side with them, but another part of me knew if I did, I'd be fired, maybe worse, and what would that change? Nothing. Except maybe give Victor and his sons a reason to laugh even harder. But then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. I was walking the perimeter, notebook in hand, when I caught a glimpse of one of Victor's sons, Danny, struggling to move a heavy sod roller. He tripped, cursed, and fell face first into the dirt, scraping his hands. I couldn't help myself. I laughed. Not a cruel laugh, just a human laugh at the absurdity of life, and for a second, it startled him. He glared, muttered something under his breath, and I realized these men, for all their power and arrogance, weren't invincible. They were just people, fumbling through consequences they thought they controlled. And that gave me an idea, a plan that I wasn't sure I had the guts to pull off yet. I started talking to the families about it, carefully, almost in whispers. "We can make them see us," I said one night at the Thompson house, candles flickering, kids in the corner clutching blankets. "We can show them the cost of what they've done, the faces they've hurt. If we're smart, if we stick together." And for the first time in weeks, I saw hope, tiny sparks flickering in their eyes. Maybe it wasn't about stopping the law. Maybe it was about making them understand that even a man with money and power couldn't erase people, couldn't erase memory. And then came the confrontation I'd been dreading. The night Victor Miller decided to host a celebration for the new fairway, complete with champagne, suits, and a live band. Like the destruction of 12 graves was a reason to party. I showed up, not as a cop, not as an official, but as a witness, as someone who had seen the human cost. I slipped past the gates, blending with the caterers, and I watched him laugh, toast, grin, and I felt a rage unlike anything I'd ever felt. I thought about every widow, every child, every crushed memory, and I realized I couldn't just let this slide. So I did something impulsive, reckless. I started playing the audio recordings, broadcasting them from a little speaker hidden in the bushes. Families speaking about the graves, stories about their loved ones, voices raw and real, crying and angry and unforgettable. And slowly, the guests started to notice. People stopped laughing. Conversations faltered. Victor's grin faltered. He stormed over, furious, demanding to know what the hell was happening. And I just smiled, the kind of smile that's part triumph, part defiance, and said, "This is what you erased, Victor. This is what you destroyed." Chaos erupted. Some guests tried to leave, others froze, unsure what to do. Victor's sons were red in the face, screaming, and the band packed up in a hurry, unsure if they were part of a crime scene. And in that moment, I didn't feel fear. I felt power. Not legal power, not authority power, but the power of truth, of memory, of people refusing to be erased. That night, Victor didn't touch me, didn't retaliate directly, but I knew the war wasn't over. It was only escalating, the tension thicker than ever, in me. I was right in the middle, carrying both the burden and the hope of a dozen families who refused to be forgotten. By the end of that night, I felt exhausted, exhilarated, and terrified all at once. I realized that sometimes justice isn't clean, it isn't perfect, and it certainly isn't safe. Sometimes it's loud, messy, and personal. And I knew we had to be smarter, bolder, and maybe, just maybe, we could make a difference, one stubborn heart at a time. And that's where we are now, standing at the edge of the storm, families clinging to each other, me clinging to my conscience, and the Millers, well, they think they still control everything. But little do they know, every story, every memory, every whisper from those graves is building a wave, and when it hits, It's going to be something they'll never forget. The next morning, the air felt different, heavy with tension, like the town itself was holding its breath. I drove past the graves again, now fully leveled, the flowers and crosses gone, just raw earth staring back at me. And I couldn't stop thinking about the families, the kids, the widows, everyone who had poured their hearts into a place that no longer existed. I knew I had to move fast, because Victor and his sons, they don't wait, they don't hesitate, and they certainly don't forgive. I spent the morning calling the families, gathering them quietly, whispering plans, plotting small acts of resistance that might make the Millers see that power isn't everything. And as I walked past Maple Street for the last time that day, I felt something in me shift, like I was no longer just enforcing the law. I was fighting for the humanity behind it. The confrontation happened at Victor's office, a glass palace overlooking the fairway. I walked in, not with fists, not with weapons, just a folder full of everything we'd documented. Photographs, recordings, letters, testimonies. I slammed it onto his desk, loud enough to make him jump. "You need to see this," I said, voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "Every family, every grave, every life you've touched, you think this is a game, but it's real, and it's all here." Victor leaned back, brow furrowed, trying to mask surprise, but the truth is, he couldn't. His sons flanked him, arms crossed, glaring, but they didn't say a word. And in that silence, I realized something. Silence can be louder than any shout. "What's this supposed to prove?" Victor finally said, voice low and dangerous. "You think I care about a dozen graves? About people whining?" I shook my head slowly. "No, but I care about what happens when the rest of the town sees what you've done. And they will. They're already talking. You've underestimated them, underestimated me, underestimated the weight of the lives you thought you owned." He laughed, sharp, cutting, and for a second it felt like I was about to break under it. But then I remembered the faces I'd seen, the grief, the courage, and I held my ground. The rest of that day felt like a chess game. Emails sent, whispers in the town, journalists calling quietly, families showing up at the edges of the fairway just to be seen. And I watched Victor start to sweat, his control slipping, little by little. The kids waving signs, neighbors posting photos online, the story spreading. It was all small, subtle, but it was relentless. By the time evening came, he knew he couldn't ignore it, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, not victory, not yet, but the sense that maybe, finally, justice wasn't just an abstract word. It was alive, messy, and human. And then came the final confrontation, the one that would stick with me forever. I walked the fairway at dawn, alone, watching the mist curl around the trees like ghosts. Victor and Danny came out, golf clubs in hand, casual smiles plastered over tension. "Going for a morning stroll?" Victor asked, mocking. I shook my head. "No, I'm here to talk, for the last time." Danny scoffed. "Last time? You're persistent, I'll give you that." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything. The families, the graves, the anger, the hope. And I said, "You've taken enough. You've crushed history, people, memories. And now, you're going to understand what that really costs." And then, I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I led them to the edge of the property, where the families had gathered quietly, just out of sight. Children peeking from behind trees, elders with trembling hands holding photographs, and I let Victor and Danny see it. I let them see the faces, the grief, the determination. Victor's jaw tightened, Danny's eyes flicked nervously, and for the first time, I saw them hesitate. The arrogance faltered. The power they thought unbreakable cracked. I didn't say a word after that. I didn't have to. The family's presence, their courage, it spoke louder than any threat I could make. And in that silence, I realized that sometimes the strongest action isn't violence, isn't legal maneuvering. It's simply showing the truth. Victor turned, muttering something about lawsuits, threats, vengeance. But I knew in my gut, in that moment, that the tide had shifted. He couldn't erase the people who refused to be erased. He couldn't take away the memories, the lives, the bonds. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope, fragile and trembling, but real. Real enough to keep fighting. Real enough to remind the families that even when the law feels cold, humanity can push back. That night, I walked past the graves one last time. The dirt's still bare, the cross is gone, but the stories remained. In every whispered conversation, every photograph, every memory told, those 12 graves were alive in a way that Victor Miller could never destroy. And I thought about the families, their resilience, their courage, and I felt a profound respect, a deep gratitude, and yes, a little pride for being part of their fight, for standing, however imperfectly, on the side of right. I can't say it's over. Victor won't stop, not really. And some of the families will have to move. That's the bitter truth. But the story isn't just about a golf course or 12 graves. It's about memory, about justice, about the idea that even in a world where power seems absolute, people, ordinary, flawed, human people, can resist, can matter, can be remembered. And I guess that's what I want people to take from this. Sometimes, standing up doesn't mean winning cleanly. It doesn't mean playing fair. Sometimes, it means being messy, being human, being willing to feel every ounce of grief and anger and hope all at once. So now I sit here, back in my truck, looking at Hawthorne's skyline, thinking about everything that's happened. I know there's more to come. I know the Millers will try to fight back. But I also know this. We're not invisible. We're not powerless. And every memory, every story, every family who refuses to be forgotten, that's their reckoning waiting to happen. And I'll leave you with this. If you were in my shoes, if you saw 12 graves destroyed and families displaced, what would you do? Would you follow the law? Or would you follow your conscience? Would you fight, quietly or loudly? Or would you stand by and let history be erased? I want to hear your thoughts, your stories, your opinions, because this isn't just my story. It's about all of us, about what we value, about who we are when no one's looking. Comment below, share your voice, and let's remember together, because memory, in the end, is more powerful than any bulldozer, any fairway, any man who thinks he owns the world.